The car sat in the back corner of the auction floor, like something a janitor had forgotten to haul out. The hood was dull and pitted, the paint a faded olive brown that no one had asked for and no one had tried to keep. A hand-typed lot tag hung from the door handle on a loop of string, $4,000 to $7,000, no reserve. The people who walked past it did not slow down. They did not look. There was nothing in it that asked to be looked at. And then a man in a worn canvas jacket crouched beside the driver's side door, pulled a small flashlight from his pocket, and angled the beam beneath the rocker panel with the quiet, unhurried patience of someone who already suspected something the room did not. His name was Denzel Washington. Not the name anyone in that room was expecting to read on a buyer's registration card at the Whitmore Heritage Auction House in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And yet there he was, crouching in the back of a hall that smelled of floor wax and old money, looking at a car nobody wanted, while the woman who ran the most prestigious estate sale operation on the East Coast walked past him, glanced down, and said 5 words loud enough for the preview guests nearby to hear. That lot is not viable. Her name was Caroline Voss. She was the founding partner of Whitmore Heritage, the kind of woman whose approval could add $100,000 to any lot she chose to stand beside. She was wearing a dove gray suit and the expression of someone interrupted by a problem beneath her attention. She looked at the car, then at the man beside it, and then back at the car, with the brief, complete dismissal of a person sorting through things they do not intend to keep. Denzel did not stand up. He moved the flashlight 3 inches to the left and kept looking. That was a Tuesday morning. 7 days later, the same car sold in a dedicated single-lot auction at the same Whitmore Heritage venue for $4,850,000. And if you want to understand how that happened, you need to go back further than Tuesday. You need to go back to a house in West Philadelphia 31 years ago, and a man who spent his whole life looking at things other people had already decided were finished. His name was Earl Washington. He was Denzel's father. Earl Washington had worked for 34 years as a line foreman at Caldwell Motor Works, a mid-size manufacturer that had supplied body components to American racing teams during the brief, incandescent period in the late 1950s and early 1960s when American factory prototype racing was producing some of the most technically sophisticated automobiles ever built on this continent. Earl had not been an engineer. He had not been a designer. He had been the man who stood on the floor and watched things get made, day after day, year after year, until the watching became a kind of knowledge that no textbook could have produced. He had kept notebooks, small green composition books, 37 of them, filling the top shelf of the bookcase in the den of the row house where Denzel had grown up. Each notebook contained hand-drawn sketches, measurements, component descriptions, supplier notations, and the kind of observations that only accumulate when a person has the patience to look at the same thing 1,000 times and still believe there is something left to see. The car Earl talked about most was one he had never personally touched. He had seen it only once, on the floor of Caldwell's fabrication bay in the spring of 1963, before it was transported under a tarp to the racing team's private facility in rural Delaware. Its designation was the Caldwell Type 9, the only one ever built. A factory prototype produced for a single racing season, and then, according to the official record, destroyed in a facility fire in the autumn of 1966. According to the official record, Earl Washington had never fully believed that. Not because he had evidence to the contrary, because he knew what that car was made of, and he had spent 34 years watching things get made, and he knew that a car built the way the Type 9 had been built did not simply disappear. He died of a stroke 4 years ago, on a Sunday morning in March, with 37 green notebooks on a shelf and a story he had never finished telling. Denzel had read every notebook. He had done it over the course of 3 months after the funeral, sitting at the kitchen table of his father's house, in the evenings while his daughter Ava did her homework at the other end of the table, because he could not be in the house and not be doing something that kept his father present. He was 51 years old. He had spent 20 years running a restoration consulting firm out of a converted industrial space in the Fishtown neighborhood of Philadelphia. Not a flashy operation. No signs on the building that you could read from the street. A client list built entirely on reputation and almost entirely on the recommendations of one client to another. He drove the same black pickup he had bought 11 years ago. He wore the same canvas jacket to work every day, until the elbows wore through, and then he bought the same canvas jacket again. His daughter Ava was 19. She was studying mechanical engineering at Temple University and had her grandfather's habit of filling notebooks with things she observed. The notebooks were not green. They were whatever color the dollar bin at the drugstore produced that month. But the habit was the same. Denzel had noticed it without commenting on it. The way you notice something that moves you too much to touch directly. He had raised Ava alone since she was 9. Her mother, Renata, had left not because anything broke dramatically, but because the quiet of a life built around careful work and modest means had not turned out to be what she needed, and she had been honest enough to say so. Denzel had respected the honesty and grieved the leaving, and then gotten up the next morning and packed Ava's lunch, because the morning had to happen whether or not he was ready for it. That was 10 years ago. He did not talk about it. He had come to the Whitmore Heritage Preview that Tuesday because of a single line in the advance catalog published 3 weeks earlier in a subscription circular that went to registered buyers. Lot 62, Automotive, 1960s American, origin uncertain, partial disassembly, sold as found. It was the phrase origin uncertain that had stopped him. Most auction houses did not use that phrase. They used make unknown or unidentified. Origin uncertain was the language of someone who had looked and found something they could not classify. That small difference had been enough to bring him 2 hours early to a preview event he had not planned to attend. He had signed Ava in at the buyer's registration desk, given her a guest badge, and watched her drift immediately toward a set of vintage gauge clusters at the front of the hall with the focused attention of someone in a museum. Then he had walked the edges of the floor methodically, reading lot tags without touching anything, until he turned the corner near the loading corridor and found Lot 62. He crouched beside it with his flashlight. That was where Caroline Voss found him. That was where she said what she said, and several preview guests nearby heard it, and one of them almost smiled. Denzel moved the flashlight to the underside of the rocker panel. Then he moved it to the seam where the A-pillar met the firewall. Then he stood up slowly, put the flashlight in his pocket, and walked to the registration desk to place a paddle request. He did not explain to anyone what he had seen. He did not need to. There was another man in the room that morning. His name was Peter Slade. He was 63 years old, a buyer and reseller who had been working specialty automotive lots in the Northeast for the better part of 2 decades. He had a red pocket square, an expensive watch, and the easy, slightly bored confidence of a man who had stopped being surprised by rooms like this many years ago. He gave Lot 62 approximately 4 seconds of his attention. His expression did not change. He moved on. Ava appeared at Denzel's elbow as he was finishing the paddle registration. She was holding a spiral notebook and had already filled 2 pages. "The gauge clusters are all reproduction," she said. "Someone went to a lot of trouble to make them look original, but the screw slots are machined, not hand-cut." "I know," Denzel said. She looked past him at Lot 62. "Is that the one?" He considered the question with the attention he always gave her questions. "I'm not certain yet." She looked at the car for a long moment. "It's ugly. A lot of important things are," he said. She thought about that, turned back to her notebook, and walked back toward the gauge clusters. Denzel watched her go. The bidding room that afternoon was comfortable and mostly settled by the time Lot 62 was called. The marquee lots had cleared early, and the crowd had thinned to the core buyers and a scattering of guests who had stayed for the open bar. The Whitmore staff auctioneer called the lot with a brisk, professionally neutral tone that communicated exactly nothing about its significance. Lot 62. Automotive item, 1960s American, origin uncertain. Sold as found, no warranty, no reserve. Opening at 2,500, it reached 5,000 in 40 seconds. Then the room went quiet. The way rooms go quiet when something is present but nothing is desired. Denzel raised his paddle at 6,000. Peter Slade, positioned near the side wall with his arms crossed, noticed the bid the way a man notices a move at a card table that he did not expect. He studied Denzel across the room. The canvas jacket, the stillness, the fact that the man was watching the car and not the auctioneer. Slade raised his paddle. 7,000. Denzel. 9,000. Slade looked at Denzel for 5 full seconds. Something in the calculation behind his eyes shifted. Whatever was in that car, Slade did not know what it was. And a man who has been doing this for 20 years does not keep bidding on something he cannot see. He set his paddle on his knee and did not lift it again. The gavel came down. $9,100. A Whitmore junior appraiser named Brendan Cole was handling the paperwork at the side table. He slid the sale confirmation across the counter and watched Denzel sign his name. He hesitated for half a beat before asking, because he was young enough that his curiosity was still faster than his professional composure. "What did you see in it?" Denzel capped his pen. "Ask me in a week," he said. Ava was waiting by the loading dock, with her notebook under her arm, watching the Whitmore crew attach the transport rigging to the car's chassis. She looked at her father with the particular evaluating attention that she had inherited from him and that he recognized every time she deployed it. "You're not going to tell me yet either, are you?" she said. It was not quite a question. "I'm not certain enough yet," he said. She accepted this the way she accepted most things he said, completely and without resentment, because she had grown up understanding that certainty was earned and not declared. He backed the flatbed to the loading door. They drove home across the bridge in the November dark, the car riding behind them, and neither of them said much. He worked alone in the shop that first night. Ava was at the library. The overhead lights turned the space a clean, even white, and he moved around the car in slow concentric circles, outward to inward, the way Earl had always worked, starting with the body, working toward what the body was protecting. The first thing was the weld seams on the inner sill. They were not production welds, not automated, not repetitive. They were hand-placed with a distinctive rhythm, a specific spacing interval that belonged to a specific kind of builder. Someone trained before the era of jig welding. Someone who worked by touch and by eye, and by 30 years of accumulated habit. Denzel photographed every seam. He composed each shot carefully, making sure the resolution would hold under magnification, because he already knew he was going to need someone else to see exactly what he was seeing. He opened the hood. The engine was original. He could tell by the gasket lines, by the casting texture, by the way the block sat in the bay with the particular settled quality of something that had never been removed. He tilted the flashlight toward the inner face of the block, the side that faced the firewall, the side that most people never looked at because it required putting your face inside the engine bay and holding it there for an uncomfortable length of time. The casting mark was there, pressed into the iron, 2 letters, 1 number, 1 year, C9, 1963. Denzel did not make a sound. He read it 4 times. He held the flashlight steady and read it 4 times, because his father's voice was very clearly in his head, reading from Notebook 22 on an evening in 1991, the two of them at the kitchen table in the row house, with the television going in the other room. If you ever find a C9 block cast in 63, the chassis plate will be missing. That's normal. They removed them in transit. What you look for next is the secondary stamp. Denzel withdrew his head from the engine bay and stood in the silence of his shop for a long moment. The chassis plate in the standard location had been removed. The mounting holes were there, clean and empty, and 30 years old. He did not need the plate. He needed the secondary stamp. Factory prototype cars of this era, built by teams rather than production lines, almost always carried a secondary identification mark placed somewhere inconvenient. Somewhere that only survived if no one had reason to look. He removed the glove box housing. 4 screws, a 10-minute job. He reached the lamp behind the dash rail and held it steady. The stamp was cut directly into the frame steel. 4 characters, CT91, Caldwell Type 9. Number 1, the only one ever made. He sat down on the shop floor with his back against the rear tire and stayed there for a while. Ava came home at 10:47. She found him standing at the workbench with a cup of coffee he had not drunk, looking at his father's 22nd notebook, which was open to the page he knew by memory. She did not ask what he had found. She looked at his face and understood the shape of it. She sat on the high stool at the end of the bench and waited, because she had also inherited his patience, and she understood that some things needed to be arrived at in their own time. After a long moment, Denzel said, "Your grandfather was right." She looked at the car. She looked back at him. "How right?" he told her. He told her about the weld seams and the casting mark and the secondary stamp. He told her about the Caldwell Type 9 and the 1966 fire, and why Earl had never believed the official record. He told her about 22 notebooks and 34 years of watching, and the patience that produced a kind of knowledge you could not buy or borrow. When he finished, Ava sat for a moment. Her notebook was open in her lap. She had not written anything in it. "What does it mean?" she asked. Not the market question, the real question. He looked at the car. "It means he was right to keep looking," Denzel said. "It means it mattered that he never stopped." She nodded once. The kind of nod that contains more than agreement. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he had not used in 3 years. Dr. Margaret Caldwell Price was 74 years old. She was the granddaughter of the founder of Caldwell Motor Works and the author of the only comprehensive academic history of the company's racing program, published by a university press in 2004 and read by perhaps 400 people in the entire country. She had retired from the faculty of the University of Delaware's History Department 8 years ago and now lived on a small property outside of Wilmington with 2 dogs and a filing cabinet that contained every surviving Caldwell factory document she had spent 40 years tracking down. She answered on the 4th ring. It was 11:30 at night. Her voice was alert in the way of someone who expects calls at unusual hours from unusual people, because that had been the nature of her work for 4 decades. Denzel did not explain the full situation. He read her 3 things from his notes: C9, 1963, CT91, and the weld spacing interval, which he described in millimeters because she would know immediately what the measurement meant. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that he checked the screen to confirm the call was still connected. Then Dr. Caldwell Price said, in a voice that had become very careful and very quiet, "Send me photographs, everything you have. Right now." He sent 63 images. At 1 in the morning, she called back on video. She had a colleague with her on screen, a retired engineer named Frank Ostrowski, who had spent 12 years in the 1980s and 90s working to recover lost Caldwell factory records from storage facilities in Delaware and Ohio. Frank had not seen these photographs before. He went through them without speaking for nearly 25 minutes. When he finally spoke, he pointed at the image of the inner sill weld seam on his screen and said, in the flat measured voice of someone who had been waiting his entire professional life to say exactly this, the spacing. 14-millimeter interval. That's Thomas Webb's hand. Dr. Caldwell Price translated the weight of that, though it required no translation. Thomas Webb had been Caldwell's chief fabricator from 1959 through 1966. He had hand-built every factory prototype the company ever produced. His 14-millimeter weld interval had been documented in one technical paper, published in a trade archive in 1987, read by perhaps a dozen specialists. Dr. Caldwell Price looked at Denzel through the screen and spoke plainly. If the engine is original and the stamp is what you're describing, then what you have is the Type 9. There is no other car with these marks. The fire destroyed the records. It destroyed the components in storage. It did not destroy this car, because this car was not there. Denzel asked the question that came next. Estimated value? Dr. Caldwell Price was quiet for a moment. We need formal authentication before a number is appropriate. But if the market for singular American factory prototypes is what it was 18 months ago, I would say 4 to 6 million is a conservative range. It could exceed that depending on who is in the room. He ended the call. He set the phone face down on the workbench. He walked to the window of the shop and looked out at the street. The November wind was moving a paper coffee cup along the curb in short, stuttering intervals. A light was still on in the apartment above the hardware store across the street. He stood there for a long time. Behind him, Ava was still sitting on the stool. She had not moved. She was looking at the car the way her grandfather had described, looking at the Type 9 on the fabrication floor in the spring of 1963, with the particular attention of someone who understands, for the first time, exactly what they are seeing. There are moments in a life when everything you thought you were doing turns out to have been preparation for something you did not plan. This was one of those moments, and Denzel recognized it the way his father had taught him to recognize things that matter. Not by announcement, by weight. The black sedan appeared outside the shop at 8:40 in the morning on the 5th day. Denzel saw it from the second-floor landing while he was carrying a mug of coffee down to the shop. idling engine, tinted glass, the particular stillness of a car that is waiting, not parked. Peter Slade came through the unlocked roll-up door at 8:52. He did not knock. He looked at the shop with the quick, practiced survey of a man accustomed to assessing spaces before their owners have a chance to perform them. He registered the pegboard tools, the hydraulic lift, the calendar from an oil supplier on the back wall. He registered the car on the lift. He looked at Denzel. "You bought the lot 62 at Whitmore last Tuesday," he said. "I did," Denzel said. "I want to buy it from you." He had a young associate with him, a man in a charcoal blazer with a folder in his hand. The folder was open before Denzel had answered. The number printed on the first page was $280,000. Denzel looked at the folder without touching it. "No," he said. Slade had the particular stillness of a man who had not heard that word in a professional context in some time. He recalibrated by a fraction. "You paid $9,000. I'm offering $280,000. That is a reasonable offer." "No," Denzel said again. "Same word, same weight, same exact distance." Slade's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. He became deliberate. There are people associated with the original estate who believe items of undisclosed, exceptional value may not have been properly catalogued. There are attorneys looking at the original sale terms. His associate shifted his weight slightly to one side, which was all the information Denzel needed about how solid that argument was. The lot was sold as found, no reserve, no warranty, no representation of value, Denzel said. Whitmore Heritage made no claims about the vehicle in either direction. I read the sale terms before I placed a bid. The purchase is complete. The associate became very still. Slade looked at Denzel for a long moment, the recalculating attention of someone whose opening move has landed without effect. Then he said, $400,000, final. Denzel picked up his coffee mug and looked out the shop window at the street. The sedan was still idling at the curb. He set the mug down. "I think you should go," he said quietly. Completely. Slade looked at the car on the lift one more time. The look of a man who is managing a loss in private. He buttoned his jacket, nodded once to his associate, and walked out through the roll-up door without another word. Denzel watched the sedan pull away from the curb. Then he picked up his phone and called Dr. Caldwell Price. "We need to move faster," he said. "What happened next is the part of the story that most people wouldn't have predicted. Not the auction, not the number. Something quieter than either of those things, Doctor." Margaret Caldwell Price arrived at the shop at 9 in the morning on the 6th day, driving a dark green Volvo wagon that was 15 years old and carrying a leather document case and a 35mm film camera in a canvas shoulder bag. She had driven from Wilmington. She parked at the curb, walked through the open roll-up door, and stopped just inside, looking at the car from across the shop floor. She stood there for almost a full minute without speaking. Then she set down her bags and walked toward the bar car slowly. Not cautiously. The way you walk toward something you have waited a very long time to see. She placed one hand flat on the inner sill weld, her eyes closed for a second. When they opened again, they were wet. "Thomas Webb welded this," she said. Not to Denzel, to the shop, to the car, to something in the room that was older than either of them. The authentication took 4 hours. Dr. Caldwell Price worked with the methodical patience of someone who had spent 40 years doing exactly this, photographing everything on film, cross-referencing each finding against documents she had brought in the leather case. Original Caldwell factory blueprints. Thomas Webb's annotated build logs. A set of supplier invoices from 1962 and 1963 that she had tracked down from a storage facility in Odessa, Delaware, 12 years ago and never imagined she would actually need. The chassis stamp matched the build logs. The casting mark matched the block records. The weld geometry matched Webb's documented technique precisely. And then Dr. Caldwell Price found something that even Denzel had not found. Tucked into a narrow recess behind the inner dash rail, clipped to the frame steel with a wire fastener, was a flat metal cylinder. The kind a careful man might construct from materials available in a factory workshop. Inside the cylinder, wrapped around a short wooden dowel, was a sheet of paper. A factory build sheet dated April 14, 1963, chassis designation CT91, engine designation C6309, sign-off line at the bottom, T. Webb, Senior Fabricator. The handwriting was the tight, backward-leaning cursive of someone who had spent years writing, in the margins of blueprints. Dr. Caldwell Price held the paper in both hands. She did not speak for a long time. When she finally looked up, her face was doing something complicated. "He hid it here," she said. "Thomas Webb hid it here because he knew the car was going to disappear. He wanted someone to be able to prove what it was." Ava was standing in the doorway of the shop. She had come down from upstairs and was leaning against the frame with her notebook under her arm, watching the old woman at the workbench with the grave, steady attention of someone who understands that a thing is happening that will not happen again. By 4 in the afternoon, Dr. Caldwell Price had signed and notarized the formal authentication certificate. The document stated, in the precise and unhurried language of someone who had spent 40 years preparing to write exactly this sentence, that the vehicle bearing chassis designation CT91, engine casting dated 1963, and factory build sheet signed by Thomas Webb, senior fabricator, was the Caldwell Type 9 factory prototype, number 1 of 1, the sole surviving example, and that its estimated fair market value in the current collector automobile market fell between $4 million and $6 million, with potential for a higher realized price at auction, given the singular historical significance of the piece. Dr. Caldwell Price shook Denzel's hand at the door. She held it for a moment before letting go. "Your father spent years looking for this car," she said. Denzel looked at her. He had not mentioned Earl to her except briefly once by name. "I know," she said quietly. "Earl Washington submitted a research inquiry to the Caldwell Archive in 2009. He believed the Type 9 had survived. I wrote back that the evidence of destruction was inconclusive, but the trail was cold. I've thought about that letter many times since." Denzel looked at the car on the lift. "He would have found it eventually," he said. "He never stopped looking." She nodded once and got in her Volvo and drove north toward the highway. Denzel went inside and called the main line for Whitmore Heritage Auction House. The call was routed twice before reaching Caroline Voss directly, which was unusual. She answered with the brisk, managed efficiency of someone holding a full afternoon schedule, and Denzel said what needed to be said without any preamble. He owned the Caldwell Type 9. It had been formally authenticated by Dr. Margaret Caldwell Price. He wanted to sell it through Whitmore Heritage as a dedicated single-lot auction. The silence on the other end was different from the ordinary pause of professional processing. It was longer, and it had a different shape. The silence of someone whose mental picture of a previous encounter is being taken apart and rebuilt while they are still on the call. "Lot 62, Caroline Voss said. "Yes," Denzel said. Another silence. "I'll need to see the authentication documents. Dr. Caldwell Price is available for a direct conversation if you need it. She prefers a recorded call." There was the sound of something being set down carefully on a hard surface. "We'll schedule a dedicated session," Caroline Voss said. "Friday. We'll manage all preparation on our end." Her voice had retained its professional precision. But something else had left it, the particular quality of elevation that had been in every previous exchange. The vocal distance of someone addressing the room from a height. It was simply gone now. She sounded like a person on a phone call. "Is there anything else you need from us?" "No," Denzel said. "Thank you." He ended the call. That evening, Ava sat on the high stool while he worked on a 1971 two-door that had nothing remarkable about it except that its owner needed it back by the following Thursday. She had a textbook open in her lap, but she was watching him more than reading. "Are you going to sell it?" she asked. "Yes," he said, not looking up from the distributor cap he was examining. She was quiet for a moment. "Grandpa never found it." He set the distributor cap down. He looked at his hands on the workbench. "No," he said, "he didn't. But he's why you did." He looked at her. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the car on the other lift, the Type 9, in its dull paint, in its patient stillness. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly right." She closed the textbook. "Then he found it," she said. "He just needed you to be the one to pick it up." He looked at her for a long moment. She had her grandfather's certainty. The unargued, unhurried kind. He turned back to the distributor cap and did not say anything else. He did not need to. The Whitmore Heritage press release went out on Thursday morning at 8 o'clock. Special dedicated session. Friday 11 a.m. 1963 Caldwell Type 9 factory prototype. Sole surviving example. Authentication by Dr. Margaret Caldwell Price. By 9:30, 4 international automotive history publications had picked up the announcement. By 10, 11 remote bidders had registered from 6 countries. By the time Denzel and Ava walked through the Whitmore front doors, Friday morning, the main bidding room held more people than it typically saw at its flagship spring sales. Denzel wore a white button-down shirt and dark trousers, no tie, the same canvas jacket he wore every day. Ava wore a dark blazer and had her notebook in her bag. They had driven over the bridge in the black pickup, the same as always. People looked at him when they walked in. Not with the glance of recognition that accompanies celebrity. With the specific attention of people who have recently revised an assumption about a man they underestimated 3 days ago, and who are now watching him move through a room and finding that he moves exactly the same way. Brendan Cole, the junior appraiser, met them at the entrance with 2 buyer access cards. He handed Ava her card and held Denzel's a half-second longer than necessary. "I looked up your firm," Brendan said. "I didn't know you'd done the Hartley Estate collection in 2019. "You weren't supposed to," Denzel said. He took the card, and they walked through to the seller's waiting area. Peter Slade was already in the bidding room when Denzel walked through on his way to the seller's position. Seated in the 3rd row. Arms folded, jaw set. He had registered to bid. He had come because whatever else Peter Slade was, he was a professional, and a professional comes back to the table even when the terms have turned against him. Denzel noted this without comment. Dr. Caldwell Price was in the front row, her leather document case on the seat beside her. She was looking at the car on the presentation platform with the expression of someone sitting with a very old promise that has finally been kept. Caroline Voss stepped to the podium. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when everyone in them has already decided to pay attention. She introduced the lot with the careful, precise language that the authentication documents provided, and something in her voice was different from the brisk, elevated certainty she had carried on Tuesday morning. She was reading from notes. The notes were good. She had prepared them well. But beneath the preparation was something else, a particular quality of public reckoning that most people in the room could not have named but could feel. She was a woman standing at a podium, describing the value of something she had called valueless 3 days ago, and she knew that everyone in the room who had been in the preview hall on Tuesday morning knew it too. She opened the bidding at $1,500,000. It reached $2,800,000 in the first 20 seconds. 3 remote bidders came in simultaneously. The number climbed. Peter Slade raised his paddle at $3,200,000 with the controlled steadiness of a man who has decided exactly what something is worth to him and will not go past it. The number climbed past him. He stayed in until $4,100,000, and then he set his paddle on his knee and left it there. The bidding moved between 2 remote lines. It climbed. $4,400,000, $4,600,000, $4,800,000, $4,850,000, and the room went still. Caroline Voss looked out over the room. $4,850,000. Going once. Silence. Going twice. The room held. The gavel came down. Sold. The room released. Applause, voices, the soft sound of chairs. Denzel was standing at the side of the room near the wall. Ava was beside him. She had not been watching the bidding. She had been watching her father's face. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. His expression was not triumph. It was not even satisfaction in the ordinary sense. It was something quieter and older. The expression of a man who has completed something that was never entirely his to begin with. She put her hand into his without being asked. Peter Slade stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out through the side door with the unhurried gait of a man who has lost cleanly and knows it. He did not look back. That at least was a form of dignity. Dr. Caldwell Price did not stand. She sat in the front row with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes gone bright, looking at the car on the platform. After a long moment, she reached into her document case and removed a photograph. Black and white, 8 by 10, printed on the heavy paper of another era. She had not shown it to Denzel before. It was the Caldwell fabrication floor, April 1963. 2 men standing beside the Type 9, its body panels complete and perfect. One of the men was Thomas Webb. The other was a younger man in a factory uniform, early 20s, looking at the car with an expression that Denzel recognized immediately. It was the expression of a man who is looking at something and already understanding that he will spend the rest of his life thinking about it. Written on the back of the photograph in Webb's backward-leaning cursive, CT91. First and last. Dr. Caldwell Price held it out to Denzel without speaking. He took it. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at her. "I want to give you something," she said. "I've been holding the Caldwell archive for 40 years because I believed someone would eventually need it. You needed it. That's what archives are for." She pressed the photograph into his hand. "Now, about Caroline Voss." The consequences arrived quietly, the way consequences often do when an institution catches up to a single person's judgment. 3 of the major collectors who had been present at the Tuesday preview submitted formal feedback to the Whitmore Heritage Board within 48 hours of the auction. They did not allege misconduct. They raised a question about whether the public characterization of a lot as not viable, made by a senior partner in earshot of multiple preview guests, represented a standard of professional conduct consistent with the firm's reputation. The board met. It was a short meeting. Caroline Voss had built Whitmore Heritage over 19 years into the most respected estate auction operation in the Northeast, and that record was real, and it mattered, and it was not enough to settle the specific question on the table. She was placed on a professional review period. Her partner authority over lot appraisals was suspended pending a firm-wide review of preview communication standards. A formal policy was drafted requiring that any public characterization of a lot's value by a firm partner be reviewed by a second appraiser before public delivery. It was not a firing. It was something more uncomfortable than a firing. It was a correction. The kind that stays in a professional record and changes the shape of what comes next. Brendan Cole, the junior appraiser, was the one who had drafted the initial Lot 62 catalog description. Origin uncertain had been his language. He had used it because he was 26 years old and cautious, and had not been certain what he was looking at, and uncertain felt more honest than a specific claim he could not support. The board noted this in the review. It noted it favorably. 6 weeks later, Brendan was promoted to lead appraiser for automotive and mechanical lots. Caroline Voss requested a private meeting with Denzel 4 days after the auction, not at the Whitmore offices. At a coffee shop 2 blocks from his shop in Fishtown at 7:30 in the morning, before either of them was due anywhere else. She arrived first. She was not wearing the dove gray suit. She was in a dark coat and wool scarf, both hands around a coffee cup, looking like a person rather than a position. When Denzel sat down across from her, she did not ease into it. "I owe you an apology," she said, "not because of what the car turned out to be. What I said on Tuesday morning was a judgment about value that I had not earned. I said it in front of other people because I was in the habit of being right in front of other people, and I want you to know that I understand the difference between those 2 things now." Denzel looked at her steadily. "I heard what you said," he said. "My daughter heard what you said." Caroline Voss held his gaze. Something moved across her face that she did not attempt to manage. "I know. She's 19, he said. "She's going to spend her entire career in rooms where people decide what she's worth before they've looked at what she's built. I would have preferred she learned that lesson somewhere other than a Tuesday morning at Whitmore Heritage while she was writing in her notebook about gauge clusters." The coffee shop was quiet around them. A barista was wiping down the counter. Rain had started on the window behind Caroline Voss, light and steady. "I don't have an answer to that," she said. "I don't think there is one that's adequate." "No," Denzel said. She looked at him. "Is there anything I can do? Professionally, I mean. Not to make it right. I don't think I can make it right, but something that goes in a different direction than Tuesday did." He considered this for a moment. "The junior appraiser," he said. "Brendan Cole. He wrote the catalog description. He used the words origin uncertain because he wasn't sure what he was looking at, and he didn't want to claim more than he knew. That's a good habit. Make sure someone at your firm knows he has it." She nodded. "Already done," she said, and it was clear that it had been. He picked up his coffee. He drank from it. Outside, the rain on the window was picking up. "I'm going to write you a formal letter," she said. "You don't have to," he said. Not coldly. Not with theater. Just the statement of a man who has already decided where he stands. "But if you need to write it, write it. That's your decision." He left the coffee shop at 7:53. He had a 1969 coupe in the shop that needed a full brake line rebuild, and he had told the owner Thursday. 3 weeks passed. Denzel did not move the shop. He did not buy a new truck. He did not change the sign on the building, which had never had a sign in the first place. He opened a trust account for Ava at the credit union on Frankfurt Avenue, a significant amount structured so that it would give her options when she needed them, and no instructions about what those options should be. He set aside a portion toward an expansion of the shop, a second lift, which would allow him to take on work he currently had to turn away. He called the contractor on a Wednesday and scheduled the installation. He kept Earl's 37 green notebooks on the shelf above the main workbench, where they had always been, ever since the day he had carried them from the row house in West Philadelphia after the funeral. Dr. Caldwell Price sent a package 2 weeks after the auction. Inside was the black and white photograph from the fabrication floor, framed now in simple dark wood. And beneath it, in a flat archival sleeve, 3 pages of Earl Washington's 2009 research inquiry to the Caldwell Archive, with her original response clipped to the front. She had written a note on Caldwell Price letterhead, the old letterhead from the university, the kind she had not used in 8 years. For the record, he was right, and I should have said so. Denzel hung the photograph above the workbench between a wiring diagram for a 1969 coupe and a photograph of Earl Washington standing in front of a Caldwell prototype at a motor show in Philadelphia, sometime in the early 1980s. Earl was younger in the photograph than Denzel was now. He was looking at the car the way he had always looked at things, with the patient, unhurried attention of someone who knows there is always something left to see. On a Thursday afternoon 3 weeks after the auction, Ava came down to the shop while Denzel was on his back under the 1971 two-door that still needed the exhaust manifold sorted. She climbed onto the high stool, opened her notebook to a fresh page, and looked at the wall above the workbench. She looked at the 2 photographs, the 2 men, 2 generations, both of them looking at cars that most people had already decided they understood. "Dad," she said. "Yeah," he said from under the chassis. "I want to learn how to read a weld seam." He was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said. "I'll show you Saturday." She wrote something in the notebook. He did not ask what. He stayed under the chassis, moving the flashlight slowly along the exhaust line, looking at what was there. The habit his father had given him. The habit of looking at ordinary things long enough and carefully enough that ordinary sometimes turns out to be something else entirely. He had no way of knowing what Ava would find with it. He had no way of knowing what she would see, in what back corner of what room, in what year, in what city. He only knew she would keep looking. That was enough. There are things in this world that sit in the back of rooms, tagged and priced, and largely ignored, waiting for the one person who knows where to look and why. And there are people who spend their entire lives developing that kind of sight. Not for recognition, not for reward, but because someone a long time ago showed them that careful looking is itself a form of love. Those people are almost never announced. They do not introduce themselves. They simply crouch in the back of a hall with a small flashlight, turn it toward the place most people never bother to check, and see what the room has been missing all along. Not because they are lucky, because they were taught how. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever witnessed someone being underestimated, only to discover who they really were? Share your story below. And if you want more stories like this, stories about ordinary people with extraordinary hidden depths, hit that subscribe button. I'll see you in the next one.